For decades now, the world has been looking at Japan's massive national debt, with one big question on its mind. Is this whole thing a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode? Or is it a really complex economic puzzle that we're just not quite getting? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive in and find out. So here's the central mystery, right? For 30 years, 3 decades, people have been predicting a complete, full-blown financial collapse in Japan. And yet, its government bonds are still some of the most trusted in the world, with incredibly low interest rates. So how can a country with so much debt be seen as so safe? That's the puzzle we're here to solve. And the public debate on this, it has become completely polarized. I mean, on one side, you've got a camp basically screaming that a collapse is inevitable, and on the other, you have a camp insisting it's definitely avoidable, no matter how high that debt number gets. Honestly, it's become more of an ideological fight than a real economic discussion. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise with some clear, quantitative analysis. So how do we find a clear answer in all this? Well, the key to unlocking this whole puzzle is a simple but really, really powerful economic formula. It's called the Dahmer condition, and it's the tool we'll be using to see what's really going on. So what exactly is the Dahmer condition? It's a surprisingly straightforward idea. All it says is that a country's financial health actually gets better if its economic growth, what we call its nominal GDP growth rate, is faster than the interest it has to pay on its debt. That's it. It all just comes down to a simple race. Is growth winning or is interest? Let's look at how this breaks down in a real example. So imagine a country's debt is 100% of its economy. Now, if that economy grows at 3% a year, but the interest on its debt is only 2%, the debt-to-GDP ratio actually starts to shrink over time. The country's finances improve. That little 1% difference, when you compound it over a decade, makes a huge difference. You can even think about it in terms we can all relate to: your own household budget. I mean, if your salary goes up by 3% every year, but your mortgage payments only go up by 2%, you're getting wealthier, right? It's the exact same logic for a national economy. Okay, so that's the theory. Now for the fun part. Let's actually put this formula to work with Japan's real-world numbers. This is where we go from abstract ideas to a concrete answer. First things first, we have to understand why Japan's borrowing costs have been so unbelievably low for so long. And it all comes down to the saving habits of its citizens. Japanese households hold a staggering 2,000 trillion yen in assets. And for years, over half of that has just been sitting in bank accounts earning next to nothing. This was all driven by a deep cash is king deflationary mindset. I mean, when prices are falling, your cash becomes more valuable, even if it doesn't earn any interest. All that cheap money kept the government's borrowing costs super, super low. But here's the game changer. Inflation is back in Japan. And now, with prices rising at 2% a year, all that cash sitting in a zero-interest account is actually losing its purchasing power. People are waking up to this and starting to move their money around to protect its value. And that whole shift is forcing interest rates to start climbing. So we have one side of our equation figured out. Interest rates are probably heading towards 2%. Now for the other side, growth. So nominal growth is made up of 2 parts. You take the real economic growth, that's the actual increase in goods and services, and you add the inflation rate. The projection here is for 1% real growth plus 2% inflation, which gives us a total nominal growth rate of 3%. And this chart just puts it all together so clearly. On one side, we have our projected nominal GDP growth, right there at 3%. On the other, the projected government bond yield at 2%. You can see it right there. Growth is outpacing interest. The Dahmer condition is met. According to this analysis, Japan's fiscal health is actually set to improve. But, and this is a big but, while that's the most likely scenario, it's not the only one. The Dahmer condition also acts as a pretty stark warning. There are really 2 different paths Japan could go down: the good path we just saw, and a much more dangerous negative spiral. Okay, so the good path is what we've been talking about. 3% growth beating 2% interest. Simple. But now consider the bad path. What if inflation spirals out of control? The government might have to jack up interest rates to, say, 10% just to stop money from fleeing the country. Now, even if nominal growth hits 7% in that kind of chaotic scenario, it's just not enough. The finances would start to deteriorate, and fast. And this isn't just some abstract theoretical exercise. The source warns that this bad path could lead to a negative spiral that looks a lot like what countries like Brazil and Turkey have actually gone through. It's where out-of-control inflation and skyrocketing interest rates create this vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. And the consequences of that kind of spiral? They'd be severe. A 10% interest rate would just crush companies, especially any that rely on borrowing to operate. You'd see a huge wave of bankruptcies. And at the same time, the government's own finances would get even worse. It's a crisis for everyone, public and private. And the number one goal is to avoid the scenario at all costs.
Okay, so we've looked at the formula, we've run the numbers, and we've seen the two possible futures. So let's circle all the way back to our original question and deliver the final verdict based on this analysis.
The main scenario that the author lays out is built on these 4 key numbers. And the really crucial takeaway here is that these targets, 2% inflation, 2% interest rates, and 1% real growth, are all considered pretty achievable for Japan's economy. This isn't some kind of wild fantasy. And what that means is the Dahmer condition is met. 3% growth is greater than 2% interest. And so as long as there isn't some major catastrophe, the expectation is not for a collapse, but for a slow, gradual improvement in Japan's financial position.
And this quote really just sums up the whole lesson, doesn't it? Anyone who simply points to a big, scary debt number and yells collapse is making a completely one-sided argument. You simply cannot make an accurate judgment without looking at the full picture, both the growth rate of the economy and the cost of its debt.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. After seeing how this dynamic between growth and interest can totally redefine a country's financial story, you really have to ask yourself, is a nation's debt just a static number, or is the real meaning found in the economic story that number is trying to tell us? It's something to remember the next time an economic headline tries to scare you.